Hi, my name's Seb, and I'm a BDD advocate with SmartBear. I'm also a member of the Cucumber team who bring you the open source product Cucumber. So, I would like to talk to you about behavior driven development today, and this is just an introductory talk, so I'm going to be moving through things really quickly and giving you references to check up on later if you're interested. Let's start with, what is BDD? Well, as I've already said, it stands for behavior driven development. The idea behind behavior-driven development is that collaboratively, customers, business representatives, developers and testers work together to specify and understand the behavior of the product that we want to develop, and then use that understanding to drive our development process. We do this incrementally and iteratively in an agile way, and so typically BDD is used within agile approaches. Really important to stress here, this third word, development. So although it's collaborative, it involves customers, developers and testers, quite often BDD is misunderstood as a testing activity. It absolutely is not a testing activity. Also, there are another couple of approaches that are exactly the same, or pretty much exactly the same as BDD, but that have different names, which just serves to add confusion in the marketplace. These are ATDD, or Acceptance Test Driven Development, and Specification by Example. All of these terms can be used interchangeably. So that's a BDD based on the initials. Let's have a look at the diagram that my colleague Matt Wynn put together. And this shows how we start BDD with a user story, and then we apply the three practices, discovery, formulation and automation to that story, and that then gives us an increment to our working software. These three practices need to be applied in the order shown here: discovery, then formulation and then automation, and they get applied on a per user story basis. So it's not a huge big bang effort. We do all the discovery on all the user stories and then all the formulation on all of the outputs of that discovery. Instead, we do this incrementally. Each story goes through a discovery, formulation, automation approach, and we might be working on discovery in one user story while we're automating a story that's already been discovered and formulated. So briefly, discovery is a process where we first get together with our three amigos, which would be our customer, our developer and our testers. We create a shared understanding by ensuring that we really deeply think about what this behavior implies to our system. And this needs to be done in a structured way by using examples to drive out our understanding, to be used to ask questions about, really, is this how the system is supposed to behave? And through this activity, we get to refine the rules, really get to understand the acceptance criteria. Once we've got the examples of how this user story is supposed to behave, then we document these using business terminology. We call this formulation. You may be familiar with the Gherkin language that Cucumber and SpecFlow understand, which uses the keywords given, when, then. This is not the only way to formulate the outcome of a discovery session, but it's the most common way in the industry today. So we use discovery to reach a shared understanding through rules and examples. We then move into formulation to convert or capture those examples using business terminology that can be shared and understood by customers, business analysts, testers and developers. And then finally, we use a tool such as Cucumber or SpecFlow to automate that formulated documentation so that we can ensure that the documentation is always accurately representing the behavior of the system that we're developing. So we create the documentation, we automate it, and then basically initially that automated documentation is going to fail because we haven't implemented any of that behavior in the code, and we use that failing documentation to help us and guide us through the development of that part of the system. So the first practice of BDD is discovery. And the first thing you need to know about discovery is that it's a collaborative activity, as I mentioned earlier. Three amigos is the terminology that's been used quite widely in the industry to describe this workshop, because you need to have a representative of the customer, a representative of the developers, and a representative of the testers at this workshop. That's why it's called the Three Amigos. However, the workshop's not limited to three people, nor is it limited to just those three disciplines. So you may have UX there, you may have architects there, and so on. At the Discovery Workshop, the goal is to generate a shared understanding of the problem. This is where we start learning about this particular story. And the reason we really stress this is because in our experience, what we've seen is that we frequently start developing stories or developing test plans before we have a real deep shared understanding. You start doing some work, and then you have to go and ask your business colleague or your customer colleague to say, to explain edge cases or what should happen in this case or in that case. So this is where we really ask the questions. We think deeply about the story before we start doing work that might need to be redone if we've misunderstood something. When we're asking questions of our customers, when we're asking questions of our business associates, there's always the possibility that we ask such a great question that the answer isn't in the room. This is what we talk about is discovering unknown unknowns. We're basically raising questions that people haven't thought about yet or haven't been definitively answered. And it's important to capture those questions and ensure they get answered before we start developing test plans or production code, because the answers to those questions are important enough because they may change the way the system behaves. We also want to uncover any ambiguities or misunderstandings. So if there are terms that might mean several things or terms that mean different things to different people, we need to demonstrate that. And when we get to the understanding of how this product works, then we refine our scope of the story based on this understanding. So the story that comes to the discovery session may then be split into multiple smaller stories that can be developed and delivered incrementally. And some of them may be deprioritized and never developed and implemented at all. A number of years ago, Matt Wynn developed a technique to run these structured conversations at a discovery workshop called example mapping. This slide outlines example mapping, well, very high level, and has a couple of links to more information, both the introductory article that Matt wrote and also a video of us undertaking an example mapping session. However, I just want to go over at a very high level. So at a discovery workshop that you're going to run using example mapping, the product owner or business analyst will come to the workshop with a user story and a number of acceptance criteria or rules that govern the scope of that user story. So this is the front running that the product owner or the BA typically does. The other participants come to the example mapping session, hopefully having already knowledge of what story is going to be discussed, and they will have thought about it already. So the recommendation is that an example mapping session should only be 30 minutes long maximum, and therefore everybody needs to come to that session prepared. The developer, the testers, UX people, other attendees will question and investigate their understanding of the story and the acceptance criteria or rules that govern the scope of the story by coming up with concrete examples of the behavior of the system as they understand it should be implemented. And the product owner or business analyst will respond by saying, yes, you've understood that correctly. That example is a correct representation of how the system should behave. Or they may say, no, that's not what I meant. In this situation, this is what should happen. And in this way, we refine our understanding, and we will get to refine the rules and potentially even the story itself. So it's a communication, a collaborative communication that is structured around rules and examples, and what the story and rules that come into the example mapping session may not be the same as the examples, the stories and rules that leave the example mapping session. Equally, when you come up with an example, you could come up with an example and the product owner or BA might go, oh, I hadn't thought of that, or I'm not sure what should take place in this situation. And at that point, you capture that as a question on a red card, and that question will then be allocated or assigned to somebody before the end of the discovery workshop and needs to be answered by the time you come back and continue working on this story. So that's the intention of the example mapping way of conducting a discovery workshop. And I have to tell you that I have done example mapping at hundreds of clients across the world, and it has never failed to deliver really excellent results. So let's consider an example of a bank that has a cash machine, and the customer is limited the amount that they can take out each day, just in case their account gets compromised so they don't lose too much money. And the story will come to the discovery workshop with some rules or acceptance criteria attached to it, one of which might be that the total daily withdrawals is going to be 500 euros. And that seems fairly straightforward. And one of the people at the discovery workshop decides to challenge that with an example. And the example that they come up with is, well, at 5 to midnight on January the 1st, I take out 500 euros. If I try and take out another 500 euros at 5 past midnight on January the 2nd, should I be allowed to? Because it's within a 24-hour period, and now I've gone over my 500 euro limit. So really the question is the daily limit a 24-hour limit, or is it a calendar day limit? And what we need to do is essentially get an answer that makes it clear what the rule is. In this situation, the product owner is able to answer it and says it's a calendar day, and therefore this example is a good example, and the system should work like this. So we take this example and we were going to formulate it into business readable terminology. On the right hand side of the screen, we have a feature file beginning to get written. Now, a feature file is an artifact of tools such as Cucumber and SpecFlow. If you're not using one of these tools, you'll have a different way of capturing or formulating your examples. Nonetheless, this is the most popular and common way in the industry, so I'm going to carry on using it for today. So this is a feature file. It's been given a title of ATM cash withdrawals. That may be the correct name, or you might want to refine it. It's just a title. The rule gets captured directly. We're just transcribing the text from the rule card directly into the feature file. The green card, the example, gets captured as a scenario. So here we've given the scenario the name withdrawals around midnight. Once the formulation has been done, the formulated feature file will be reviewed by the whole team. So if this name is not an adequate name, or people think that it's not clear enough, there's still time to review it and make it more meaningful. The given keyword introduces the context, things that happened in the past. So at 5 to midnight on January the 1st, we withdrew 500 euros. You'll notice that we've dropped the January the 1st because it's inessential information. What's important is that 5 to midnight, we withdrew 500 euros. And then at 5 past midnight, we request to withdraw another 500 euros. You may choose to add here on the following day if you get feedback that it's not clear that we're talking about 5 to midnight on one day and then 5 past midnight on the next day. This is the to and fro, the going backwards and forwards that the review process has to try and make sure that what we capture in the documentation makes sense to everybody concerned. So given describes the context, when describes the action that kicks off the behavior that we're expecting, and then describes the outcome. And the outcome here is that 500 euros should be dispensed because that's what we agreed with the product owner in the example mapping session, and that's what we captured on the example card. A number of principles have been applied while we did that activity, and myself and Gaspar Norge have created an acronym brief to try and help people remember the important things to consider when formulating scenarios from examples. The acronym is brief, and let's go through the 5 letters and 6 principles that this encapsulates. The scenario should be business readable. because, business terminology helps other people understand what we're talking about, as long as we make sure that the terms are rooted in the business domain and are unambiguous. We use real data in our scenarios where appropriate, because using actual data forces us to think about specific cases and helps reveal edge cases and assumptions that maybe hadn't been surfaced before that. The scenario should be intention revealing. So it should be about the desired outcomes of the people that are acting out this behavior rather than the mechanism. And so here what we mean is we don't want to talk about clicking buttons and following links and typing into edit boxes. We want to talk about what are we trying to achieve. We want to make sure that the contents of every scenario is essential. So there's plenty of inessential data that can be removed. So in particular, what we removed from the previous scenario was the dates, because the dates weren't important. And we want each scenario to be focused, so on a single rule. What we find often is that people try and test multiple different rules, multiple behaviors in a scenario, in a test case. And we really don't want that to happen, because we want a scenario to pass if the specific rule that we're illustrating is working correctly, and only fail if that rule has been incorrectly implemented. So focus each scenario on a single rule. And finally, put these 5 letters together and you get brief. Because short scenarios are our goal. We've got a heuristic where we say no scenario should be more than 5 lines, because shorter scenarios are easier to read, they're much easier to understand, and consequently they're easier to maintain. Once we've got our scenario, we then want to automate it. So the feature file that we just looked at, the given when then file with the scenario and the rule text in it, contains scenarios, maybe more than one, and each scenario is made up of a number of steps. And these steps are introduced with the keywords that we just saw, given, when, then. This is a syntax that's called gherkin. The gherkin written in the feature file on its own is not automated yet. We need to somehow glue those business readable steps to the underlying application that we're driving out. And so we have to write some automation code, some glue code, and this is made up of step definitions. Step definitions can be written in any of a number of languages. So there are lots of different versions of Cucumber and SpecFlow that are supported by the open source community. These are the main languages that we support within the Cucumber project and the SpecFlow project, but there are many others as well if you're working in PHP or Python, and pretty much any language you can think of, there is a port of Cucumber that will then allow you to write step definitions in the language of your choice. Each step that is found by the automation tool causes a single step definition to be executed. So this is the glue. The steps are glued to the application by the step definition. And the green box here indicates that Cucumber is only concerned with linking the text in your feature file to the automation code, the glue code that you have written. So Cucumber is not in any way connected to your application directly. That means that you can use any library that's available in the language that you've chosen to write the step definitions to automate your underlying application. Therefore, Cucumber doesn't support web applications. Cucumber doesn't support web services. Cucumber doesn't support rich desktop applications. Cucumber doesn't support mobile applications. Cucumber supports any language that has a library that you can use to automate your application. And it's your responsibility to go and find the appropriate libraries to use in your glue code to include in your step definitions. BDD and TDD work well together. So once you've been through discovery and formulation and you have automated your scenario, now you are ready to actually develop some code. You have a failing scenario and you will want to develop some code using whatever development approach is used in your organization, until that scenario is passing. And then you will come out and write another scenario and automate it. So in the circle here in this diagram, this is the TDD process. You have a failing scenario, and now we would encourage you to develop your software using test-driven development, TDD, and there in which you write a failing low-level test, make that test pass, refactor. This is the standard approach as popularized throughout the software development community. So BDD says let's do the discovery, formulation, and automation of the scenario before we start development, and then that failing automated scenario leads us into a test-driven loop where we might go around the test-driven loop a number of times before that scenario is passing. This is to emphasize that BDD and TDD are very closely related and work extremely well together. So I've explained very quickly what behavior-driven development is. Now let's think about the return of investment of behavior-driven development. So one of the biggest things that BDD gives us is early learning. In my professional career, I spent a lot of time picking up requirements or stories from product owners and then starting working on them, only to realize that there were gaps in the story and the acceptance criteria that came with it, and having to stop what I was doing and go back to the product owner or business analyst and ask them to explain or fill in those gaps. And this sometimes caused the business analyst or product owner to have to go back to their customer for them to ask the questions. And this is a really slow and inefficient way of working. So BDD through discovery helps us get early learning and shift left to test our understanding of what we're being asked to do before we actually go and develop it. It also, because it's a collaborative activity working in the business language, it engenders a shared understanding. Customer, developer, tester, UX engineer, security engineer, architect, we can all collaborate on the discovery and formulated documentation because it's captured in business readable language and it's generated together. This shared understanding means that my understanding of what an authenticated customer is should be the same as your understanding of an authenticated customer. We also get increased speed of feedback. So first off, because the discovery workshop is collaborative, we get immediate feedback from our questions. There's no thread on a wiki or a Confluence page. There's no waiting for emails to come back. We're in the room or in a virtual room together, working through the discovery of a particular user story, and our questions are answered immediately. But equally, there's the speed of feedback of the automated scenarios. So when we first write a scenario, we run that scenario and we expect to see it fail because we haven't implemented that functionality yet. So that's immediate feedback that this is new behavior and that we've written our automation code in such a way that it's not passing because it shouldn't be passing. So that's good feedback. And then once we've got the scenario passing, that scenario becomes part of our regression pack. And it gives us immediate feedback every time we run the regression pack that we haven't broken something that was working once before. So this speed of feedback is hugely valuable. The automated documentation ends up giving us something that we call living documentation. And this is to contrast it with the typical documentation that we have in a product, which is dead documentation. It's been written, it sits there on the hard drive or in the wiki or even in a printed pile, and it is in no way linked to the system that we're developing and delivering. On the contrary, this documentation is alive. Every time we run our scenarios, it guarantees us that the documentation is either in tune and in sync with the application as it is now, or we get a failing test that we need to fix. This means that we all have confidence that our documentation is correct. But additionally, if you have to come back to the product in several years' time to do an enhancement, you can be confident that the documentation is an accurate representation of the behavior of the product as it exists. All of these first four things lead us to have better quality software and also reduced costs. And the reduced costs come from fewer defects and, of course, less rework. Few things that we need to stress that BDD is not, because there are a number of misunderstandings in the industry around this. So first off, BDD is not a formula that's based upon the keywords given, when, then. So just because you're writing acceptance criteria using given, when, then, this does not mean that you are following a BDD way of working. And therefore, it does not mean you should expect the benefits that I described on the previous slide. Equally, if you're using an automation tool that recognizes given, when, then, such as Cucumber, or if you're using one of the many other frameworks that have adopted the given, when, then way of writing out specifications, this does not mean you're following software development using a behavior-driven approach. It just means that you're using the words given, when, then. By extension, just because you are using Cucumber to automate some of your tests, this absolutely doesn't mean that you are working in a behavior-driven way. There's nothing wrong with using Cucumber to automate tests. However, the Cucumber was developed to support behavior-driven development. And we believe that the extra costs of writing business terminology specifications that you then use to drive automation really only gets paid back upon when you follow a BDD approach. If you're just using Cucumber to automate tests, there are probably cheaper and simpler ways of doing that. Which leads me on to the second not. BDD is not about automated testing. Yes, automation is one of the practices of BDD. It's the third practice. It's a practice that should only be adopted within the BDD approach after you have already adopted discovery and formulation. BDD is not about automated testing, but automated tests are one of the byproducts of following a BDD way of working. And it's at this particular statement is the space where there's a lot of confusion on the internet. Do not adopt BDD because you want to get more automated tests. Adopt BDD because you want to produce better software and work in a more collaborative way and shift your learning to earlier in the process to reduce rework and improve quality. I talked about when we were looking at the automation practice, BDD doesn't replace TDD. They work together. We recommend you work in a test-driven way when you're developing code, and we recommend you work in a behavior-driven way when you are specifying the details of the user story. And finally, BDD is not a contract between business and delivery. So there is no silo where the business writes out given, when, then scenarios and then hands them over the fence to developers and testers. BDD is not contractual in that way. It's a collaborative activity. Which leads to the final conclusion. BDD is a set of collaborative and technical practices that support successful agile development. It's not magic. It's not magic pixie dust that is conferred by using given, when, then, or Cucumber. And in fact, adopting BDD will lead you to change the way you interact with your colleagues. And therefore, it's not something that you will adopt overnight. It's an approach that you will want to pilot, see how it works for your organization, refine that, and then roll out to a wider set of people within the organization. So, thank you very much for coming along to this session. There'll be some questions and answers after the recording has been played, which is just now, I guess, for you. But if you've got any questions that you don't want to ask now or I don't get a chance to answer, please get in touch with me on Twitter or emailing me at sebrose@smartbear.com. Thank you very much.